Nick Mercer bought his house believing, as everyone around him seemed to believe, that ownership would be the beginning of a settled life. He pictured backyard barbecues, Sunday morning coffee on the porch, the slow, comfortable rise of equity beneath his feet. The house, a narrow colonial with fluted columns and a stubborn maple in the front yard, looked exactly the way adulthood was supposed to look. 2 years later, it felt like a stage set where every cushion had been replaced with an invoice. He was 30 now, the early 30s that should have been the decade of steady growth and quiet confidence. Instead, he kept a spreadsheet, dates and dollar amounts marching across the screen like a ledger for a life that had drifted off course. Mortgage, insurance, property tax, HOA fee, furnace maintenance. Every line pushed his breathing a little tighter. The first time the furnace died in late October, the house shuddered with cold and with his panic. He called a repairman and sat on the floor of his living room, the only warm place the repairman's truck had been when he arrived, its engine. The bill arrived 3 days later, a number he memorized as if repeating it would conjure some alternative reality. He could feel the absence of a safety net as a physical thing now, a gap behind his sternum where a cushion should be. "Why didn't you tell me this was so heavy?" his sister asked on the phone. Her voice came through thin and worried. Nick had been the family's quiet optimist. Steady job, smart choices. Buying the house had been the trophy he'd been raised to want. He barked out a laugh that disappointed him for being brittle. He told her the contractor had fixed the furnace and that everything was fine. He lied as often as he could. Lying was cheaper than the truth. The house had been a dream purchased at an unlucky intersection of cultural expectation and market collapse. Nick had read articles, listened to podcasts. Broad financial wisdom turned intimate and loud the day the loan officer said, "You're approved." That single sentence carried him across the finish line. He accepted a mortgage that fit the bank's comfort and not his own. It was a decision that moved from spreadsheet to reality, and then to a place of quiet, bone-deep unease. Inside, the house creaked in rhythms that felt like Morse code. Every drip from a faucet, every squeak of a door was a reminder. The asset on paper required constant input in the form of time, money, and exhausted attention. The marriage between pride and practicality, pride won most days. When his car gave out one rainy Tuesday evening on the drive home, he stared at the dashboard as if it might offer a miracle. He had already learned that emergencies were not hypothetical. They were a ledger entry. He paid for a towel with a credit card and then spent the rest of the night awake, turning the numbers over like someone trying to unlock a safe. There's a particular cruelty to needing freedom and having a thing, an expensive thing, anchoring you. It's the game of choices with a loaded die. He couldn't leave his job even though he hated the way his boss found new, invasive ways to demand more of him. He accepted small humiliations, a snide comment in a meeting, an impossible deadline, a promotion that came with more hours and not more money. To risk those earnings felt like risking eviction. Nick's best friend Carlos saw it first. They met in a bar for beers that were half conversation and half mutual letting off of steam. Carlos lived in a modest apartment 2 neighborhoods over. He'd never owned anything more complicated than a cast iron pan, and he seemed to breathe easier than Nick. "You look thin, man. You look like you're draining." Carlos set his drink down. His eyes, normally quick with jokes, held something steadier. "You're house poor, Nick."
It was the blunt phrase that landed like a footstep in a quiet room. Nick had heard it before, blog posts and think pieces with charts that simplified human struggle into percentages. There was something different hearing it in a voice that cared. "House poor," Carlos said again, slower. "It's not a badge, dude. It's a trap." For Nick, the trap felt aesthetic and existential all at once. Everything in his life had contracted to accommodate one big thing. He saw the trade-offs like financial scars. No vacations, no eating out. Invitations declined so frequently they became a routine that friends no longer offered. If something broke, roof, heater, plumbing, he would have to borrow or borrow and borrow. He began to imagine his future as a string of small catastrophes arranged into a lifetime. At work, the tension multiplied. Nick's manager, Meredith, announced a new initiative that required a team lead with discretionary hours for client calls that often bled into evenings. Nick was the natural choice, reliable, low maintenance, captive. He took it, and in the weeks that followed, felt himself shrinking into the role of always available. The new responsibilities came chiseled with micro-abuse, frantic pings at midnight, last-minute demands. He took them because his mortgage payment was a beast that would not be ignored. The tension of this life became a companion when he met Elena. Elena lived next door. She was in her late 20s, a freelance graphic designer with a laugh that made the maple tree shiver. She knocked on Nick's door that winter when the porch light flickered during a storm and the fuse box in his house kept tripping. He'd always been polite, a little guarded. Those who knocked because of a crisis rarely stayed. But Elena lingered. She'd brought a tray of cookies, store-bought, and a practical, can-do attitude that felt like sunlight on things he'd been treating like brittle heirlooms. "You've got a problem with your wiring," she said on their second conversation, holding up the burnt-out bulb. She smiled. "Or a problem with an electrician." Nick found himself telling her the whole story. The mortgage, the calls, the fridge that coughed, and the insurance that covered less than he thought. He told her because it was no longer possible to keep the numbers inside. It was like trying to hold back tide with your hands. "What if you didn't have to be the only one paying for all of this?" she asked. "Not as charity, but as strategy. Have you ever considered renting a room?" He'd heard the idea before, strangers under your roof, privacy dissolved, calm supplanted by the unpredictability of roommates. The image of his living room filled with someone else's life felt like a violation. But Elena's voice cut through the feeling with something sharper: possibility. "Or sell," she said quietly, "and rent. Build a cushion. Buy later if you want, but buy something you can actually breathe in." Her words rattled around his skull for weeks. She had no hint of condescension when she said it. She was pragmatic about the numbers. She lived freelance and flippantly shared that she'd chosen a smaller life to buy herself time to choose bigger things later. Travel, art residencies, the sort of luxuries he had been trained to think of as adult failures. The idea lodged. It grew roots. At night, Nick lay awake thinking about roofs and roofs of possibilities. He imagined a life where the ledger was not the loudest sound, where art classes weren't something he watched on YouTube, but actually took, where his father's laugh could be heard without his own chest tightening from worry. He began to research like a man trying to learn a foreign language in a month. He read blogs and forums, listened to financial podcasts, the same ones that had soothed him into buying a house now opened a different door. Conservative budgets, 3 to 6 months emergency funds, the value of liquidity.
He checked his mortgage rates again. The numbers on his laptop felt like a scalpel, and a scalpel can be wielded to cut away dead tissue. Refinancing surfaced as a way to buy small breathing room. He spoke to a mortgage broker who explained the math in patient sentences. A half point here, some closing costs there. It could be worth it. It was possible. Not a miracle, but possible. But the heart of the change came from a conversation with Meredith that no one had planned for. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Meredith called him into her office, that glass-walled room that reflected the city's endless motion like a movie screen. He braced for news, always braced, but instead she offered him something he never thought she would: a sabbatical. Not a paid leave, his company couldn't afford that, but a 3-month unpaid leave with a promise of keeping his role if he wanted to come back. She said the words carefully, as if placing them on a scale to see whether they would tip. "Nick," she said, looking up from her notes, "you've been good, steady, but you're fraying. I don't want to burn you out." The offer smelled like irony. Meredith was not known for her generosity, but she had a reason. Her own life had been roughened by caregiving last year. She'd learned something about the cost of being always on. "Take the time," she said. "Sort this out."
Nick felt a strange lightness and a fear at the same time. Unpaid meant sacrifice, but unpaid also meant space. Space to rebuild a plan rather than just survive each month. He accepted. The first week of his leave was a sensory overload of possibilities. He slept long and then woke and did not answer emails. He made a list: sell or rent, refinance or rent out a room, take a side gig, move to a cheaper neighborhood. The decisions sprouted like seeds, and he watered them with spreadsheets. He met with an estate agent and then with an advisor. The agent touted the neighborhood's desirable school district and the house's walkability. The advisor sketched out both directions: sell now and accept a modest loss after commissions and closing, or keep the house and rent it partially. But the numbers needed to make sense. There were tax implications, legal hoops, and the emotional labor of disassembling a dream he had once assembled with certainty. At night, Alana texted him small doses of encouragement and blunt realism. If selling frees you in 5 years to buy the house you actually want, that's not failure, it's smart, she wrote. He thought of his father's voice, gentle, practical, saying, "Nick, there are 2 kinds of pride, the kind that helps and the kind that destroys." He never thought his father's aphorisms would become a map. But that was not the most suspenseful part of his arc. The real tension came when someone knocked on his front door with a problem he couldn't predict. He had posted a listing for a room. Modest, tasteful photos, a description that was half apartment ad and half apology. The first person to respond was Matthew, a young, steady teacher with a soft voice, a respectful text, and then a cautious in-person visit. Matthew moved his life into the spare room with a considerate air, like someone who had read the rules and meant to follow them. He paid rent on time and mowed the lawn and left the dishes clean. Then, 3 months later, the roof leaked. It started as a small, shameful drip, an impudent little leak that appeared above my kitchen light. I found a bucket under it, and the words, "I should have expected this," on my lips. The repair estimate when it came was more than $1,000. I had some savings, enough for a short breathing room, but not for this kind of hit. I called Matthew. "I'll have to ask you to help with the cleanup," he said. Matthew came with garbage bags and a calm efficiency that made my chest unclench. "It's okay," he said. "We'll fix it."
They spent the afternoon moving furniture and propping buckets. Nick felt oddly grateful that someone else was there to share the labor. Later, when Matthew offered to take on some small portion of the cost, because it affected his room too, Nick declined. It was his roof, he would own it, but the gesture mattered, an invisible rebalancing of weight that Nick hadn't known he needed. The months that followed were a medicine of small practicalities. He refinanced the mortgage and shaved a sliver off the monthly payment. He negotiated HOA dues and switched providers for homeowners insurance. He picked up freelance consulting on weekends, small gigs that fit into his pocket of time. He rented out storage space he'd been paying for and eliminated subscriptions that had quietly been eating his account balance for years. The changes were not dramatic at first. They were a slow accrual, drip, of good decisions until the flow pointed in a new direction. He built a 3-month emergency fund. He started investing a small amount each month. He went to therapy and learned to name the anxiety that had been masquerading as resilience. Beyond the money, he rebuilt his life from the little things. He cooked dinners more often. He invited friends over for a rooftop barbecue on a warm spring night. No expense, just potatoes, a grill, and laughter that felt like currency. He took a class in creative writing, not because it would make him richer, but because it made him more himself. The world did not suddenly become easy. There were still nights when the ping of an unpaid bill made him flinch. There were times at work when something urgent snapped at the base of his calm. But he was no longer a man trapped because of a house. He was a man holding the house as one part of his life, not the definition of it. A single small triumph came 6 months after he accepted Meredith's sabbatical. He stood in front of a small crowd in a community center and told a version of his story on a stage in a speaker's circle. No formal talk, just a human recounting. People nodded. One woman, a young mother, came up to him afterward and said, "You saved me a year of regret." She'd been on the brink of buying and had asked him finally the question he wished someone had asked him before he bought. How will this change your life, not your net worth?
The happiest ending was not a sudden windfall. It was a tidy, stubborn accumulation of choices that led to a life that fit. A year later, the house's maple tree had grown a little more, and Nick had a small stack of records of steady deposits to an account labeled Freedom. He had built a reserve, and with it, a new readiness. He and Elena had a quiet, careful romance, their conversations honest and unvarnished. She'd become not only a neighbor, but a partner in practical optimism, someone who valued life over appearances and risk managed with imagination. The big choice came in a living room lit night of conversation. They sat across from each other with mugs of tea. Outside, the neighborhood held its ordinary hush. "I've been calculating," Nick said. He watched the steam curl from his mug. "If we sell now, after fees, we're not gaining much. Maybe we break even. But we rent for a few years, build, and then buy a house that suits who we are at 35. Elena's fingers toyed with the rim of her cup. "We could also stay here, renovate, make it ours. But are you okay with the risk?" He thought of his father's two kinds of pride, and Carlos's blunt diagnosis, and Meredith's unexpected mercy. He thought of Matthew, and the night when the roof leaked, and the way neighbors had become co-authors in a story he once believed he had to tell alone. "Sell," he said at last. The word landed with light, not defeat. It felt like a deliberate unhooking rather than abandonment. He imagined a smaller rental with a garden that wouldn't swallow his income, a reserve that would let him breathe, and a future house that he would choose intentionally rather than because a bank told him he could.
They listed the house the next month. The sale process was ordinary, open house, negotiations, but their frame had changed. They weren't trying to prove anything to anyone. They were clearing the board. When the closing papers were signed, Nick walked out of the old house one final time with a small box of things that mattered. A framed photo of his father, a coffee maker, Elena's favorite mug. The keys turned in the lock, and he left the house behind with gratitude and a lightness he hadn't felt in years. On the morning they moved into a modest, sunlit rental with a paint-chipped porch, Nick brewed coffee and stood in the doorway while Elena unpacked plates. The space was smaller, yes. Cheaper, yes. Safer, yes. He breathed in and felt the ledger loosen its grip. That night he went for a walk with Carlos. The neighborhood looked the same, and yet everything felt rearranged by intention rather than obligation. "You look like a man who can sleep," Carlos said, clapping him on the shoulder. "I look like a man who finally realized the house was supposed to be a place to live, not the thing that defined living," Nick answered. He grinned, small and private, and then added, "Also, I have leftover boxes of books. You want some?" Carlos laughed. "Always." Nick's story didn't end with a sudden promotion or a miracle investment. It ended with a recalibration, one that allowed him to be 30 and hopeful and alive again. He had traded a brittle achievement for a sturdier freedom. And in the years to come, when his friends debated the virtue of owning versus renting, and when a neighbor asked his advice over the fence, Nick would tell them the same thing Elena had told him. Buy the life you can breathe in. Don't confuse a ledger for a life. He kept that sentence like a talisman. Sometimes late at night, when wind pressed against the windows and the city hummed quietly, he would turn it over in his mouth like a coin and feel, at last, that his wealth was not merely in account balance, but an ability to choose. He was no longer house poor, he was house wise.